The debt trap. Why nations keep making the same fatal mistake. There's a moment that keeps repeating throughout history. A finance minister walks into a room full of bankers and says three words: "We can't pay." What happens next has destroyed empires, toppled governments, and condemned millions to poverty. We know exactly when it's coming, yet we can't seem to stop it. Every few decades, the same tragedy unfolds. A country borrows money it can't afford, spends it on promises it can't keep, and when reality arrives, the entire economy implodes. This is documented history happening over and over again. The mechanics of collapse. The pattern is almost mathematical. It starts with a shock, war, economic downturn, or political upheaval. The government needs money fast. International lenders appear with attractive terms. Just temporary, the politicians promise. We'll invest in growth and pay it back easily. But the debt grows faster than the economy. Interest compounds. Payments balloon. Within years, more money goes to creditors than to hospitals, schools, or infrastructure. The trap has sprung. When default becomes inevitable, the IMF arrives with conditions: slash spending, raise taxes, privatize assets. Streets fill with protesters. The government falls or survives through force. Either way, ordinary citizens watch their savings evaporate. Then, incredibly, a decade later, the same country does it again. Argentina. 9 defaults and counting. Argentina has defaulted 9 times since independence. 9 times. In the early 1900s, Argentina ranked among the world's richest nations. The Pampas produced grain and beef that fed Europe. Buenos Aires rivaled European capitals in grandeur, but the foundation was unstable, depending entirely on agricultural exports. When world markets shifted, Argentina collapsed. The first default came in 1827. By 1890, Argentina's borrowing nearly destroyed a major London bank. The 20th century brought catastrophe, military coups, hyperinflation reaching 3,000% annually, populist spending sprees. The 2001 collapse froze bank accounts overnight, cycled through 5 presidents in 2 weeks with $93 billion in debt. Most remarkably, Argentina defaulted again in 2020. The political system rewards short-term promises over long-term stability. Every government buys votes with unsustainable spending. When commodity prices are high, the problem is masked. When prices fall, collapse follows. Argentina possesses natural resources and an educated population. Instead of prosperity, generations have lived with perpetual crisis. When empires fall, the Ottoman collapse. The Ottoman Empire is 1875 bankruptcy reveals how debt destroys sovereignty itself. For centuries, Ottoman sultans funded their empire through conquest. New territories meant new taxes. The system worked until expansion stopped. By the mid-1800s, the empire was contracting. Independence movements and rebellions required expensive military campaigns. European bankers offered loans. Between 1854 and 1874, Ottoman sultans borrowed over £200 million. The money funded some modernization, but much went to palaces and bribes. By 1875, half of all government revenue went just to interest payments. The Sultan announced he could only pay half of what was owed. European creditors demanded control. In 1881, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration seized entire economic sectors. Taxes on tobacco, salt, and alcohol went directly to European banks before reaching the Ottoman treasury. The humiliation was complete. Subject peoples watched their taxes flowing to foreigners and asked why they should remain loyal. Nationalist movements exploded. The empire survived another 40 years as a geopolitical zombie. When World War I ended, Turkey inherited 60% of the Ottoman debt, spending decades paying for loans taken by long-dead sultans. The lesson: sufficient debt ends sovereignty entirely. The lost decade. When a continent collapsed, the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s proved the pattern was universal. The 1973 oil embargo quadrupled prices. Middle Eastern nations deposited billions in Western banks, which needed borrowers. Throughout the 1970s, Mexico, Brazil, Venezuela, and Chile borrowed massively for development projects and corruption. Then 1979 arrived. The U.S. Federal Reserve raised interest rates to 21%. Latin American nations with variable rate debt saw payments triple. Simultaneously, global recession crushed export demand. The dollars needed to service debt vanished. In August 1982, Mexico announced, "We cannot pay." Mexico owed $80 billion. Brazil owed $87 billion. The entire continent was insolvent. The IMF imposed brutal austerity. Government spending slashed. Subsidies eliminated. Mexican real wages fell 40%. Brazilian inflation hit 2,700%. Poverty rates soared. They called it the lost decade. Political instability followed. Venezuela, once Latin America's richest nation, exploded in riots when the government raised fuel prices to meet IMF demands. By the early 1990s, debt was restructured with portions forgiven, but the damage was permanent. An entire generation saw living standards collapse, and the banks that made risky loans, they were bailed out. The citizens paid the price. Greece, the modern warning. Greece joined the euro in 2001 by hiding its true deficit with help from investment banks. For a decade, Greece borrowed at Germany's rates, expanding public employment and spending extravagantly on the 2004 Olympics. The 2008 financial crisis exposed the truth. Greece's debt exceeded 130% of GDP. Unlike Argentina, Greece couldn't print currency to inflate away debt. It was locked in the euro. The EU and IMF provided $110 billion in bailouts with devastating conditions. Public spending cut 20%, wages slashed, unemployment reached 27%, youth unemployment hit 60%. The economy didn't stabilize, it collapsed. GDP shrank 25% in 5 years. The middle class was destroyed. Hospitals ran out of medicine. An entire generation emigrated. Greece received 3 bailouts totaling $289 billion. In 2012, it restructured private bondholders' debt, wiping out 75% of their investment, the largest default in history. Today, Greece's economy remains smaller than in 2001. The lesson, even in advanced economies, the debt trap destroys lives. Why it keeps happening? The pattern is obvious, so why does it repeat? The answer is incentive misalignment. Politicians operate on election cycles. Debt operates on decades. A politician can borrow for popular programs, win re-election, and retire before the bill arrives. Voters get benefits now. Future voters get the crisis. For creditors, the incentive is equally broken. Banks profit enormously from interest when nations borrow, when nations can't pay. International institutions funded by taxpayers bail them out. The lenders win either way. Since 2020, the list of countries in crisis has grown: Sri Lanka, Lebanon, Zambia, Ghana. Global debt now exceeds $307 trillion, over 330% of world GDP. Much of it will never be repaid. The debt trap isn't history. It's happening now. And until we align political incentives with economic reality, nations will continue borrowing, overspending, and collapsing. The only question is, who's next?